As Tracy mentioned, my title is extremely long, so I'm not going to reiterate it again, but I am here to talk about some of my PhD work. So this is just a small portion of the work that led me to getting my PhD finished. I also have to say right off the bat that I absolutely detest public speaking, hence the fact you might have heard me make the comment about if there's only 3 people, do I still have to do this? But I'm going to do my best to get through this, and hopefully I'll be able to provide all of you with a little bit more information about the topic. Okay. So as Tracy mentioned, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the territories that we're on. And in this situation, it's important for me to acknowledge the territory that the research took place on. So all of the individuals that participated in my research were based in Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands. So the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And many of my participants identified with one of those nations. So I think that's even more important why I'm acknowledging these territories and acknowledging the land. So we acknowledge the ancestry, the history, the heritage, the gifts of the indigenous people across Turtle Island, and always work and play in a spirit of respect and reconciliation. So the other people that I have to thank is to thank the participants themselves. So my participants go by the name of Alex, Brittany, Danica, Darlene, Dawn, Ellen, Grace, Jessica, Joy, and Zara. And it takes a lot of bravery to trust another person with your story of sexual violence. So I appreciate so much that these 10 individuals trusted me with their story. So I'm sure we all know that there is a problem of sexual violence, and this problem is pervasive. It affects those marginalized by gender, women, two-spirit, trans, and gender non-binary people, much more than cisgender men. For instance, over 25% of women will experience sexual violence at some point in their post-secondary academic career, and this number is very minimal in the sense that it's happening a lot more than what we actually see reported. Additionally, transgender and gender non-binary post-secondary students report higher levels of sexual violence compared to their cisgender peers. So the problem is even more pervasive within our transgender and gender non-binary students. This is a major issue for post-secondary educational institutions because for the past while we've been hearing more and more incidences of sexual violence, including in post-secondary educational institutions, and basically just a very larger culture of misogyny and inappropriate policies within these institutions. So you can see on the screen just a few examples of some of the incidences that we have seen in Canada over the past few years. So what we already know is that due to the prevalence of sexual violence within post-secondary institutions, it is imperative that these settings have higher learning develop policies and procedures that actively foster environments that promote safety. Unfortunately, within post-secondary institutions, there's a history of them inadequately implementing policies and procedures that protect the victims and also take a proactive stance to create safer environments. Rather, in a lot of these institutions, there tends to be vague language, a lack of conceptual definitions on concepts such as consent, and rampant rape myths referred to and inferred within them. Additionally, numerous post-secondary institutions prioritize the safety and reputation of the institution rather than individual students, which leads to victims and survivors feeling unsupported and victimized by support services. So throughout this presentation, I used 2 major key concepts that I should probably define for all of you in the audience. I used the term sexual violence. So this sexual violence is any attempted or completed act to obtain sexual contact that is unwanted by the victim. So this includes, but is not limited to, stealthing, rape, attempted rape, sexual assault, coercion, and sexual harassment. For anyone that's not aware, stealthing occurs when an individual consents to sex with condom use, then the condom is removed or destroyed purposefully during sex, and this is considered a form of sexual violence. I also use the term victim survivor, which refers to any individual that experienced sexual violence. And the reason that I use the term is that I acknowledge that both terms have both positive and negative consequences for the individual that has experienced the violence. And it's important for those that have experienced it to be able to recognize the term that they personally prefer. Another key concept that we have to kind of get into a little bit is rape myths. So Lonsway and Fitzgerald in 1994 described rape myths as attitudes and beliefs that are generally false, but are widely and persistently held, and that serve to deny and justify male aggression against women. Since Lonsway and Fitzgerald first described rape myths, the definition has grown and surpassed heteronormative to include a broader recognition of the myths associated with sexual violence. So specifically, new authors and new theorists that talk about rape myths also talk about the effect of individuals with diverse gender identities. So specifically non-heteronormative sexualities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as men. So there's a lot of different examples of rape myths, but for the purposes of this research, the common ones that I'm going to be referring to throughout this project are the ones that are on the stage, on the screen, sorry, not the stage. So rape myths need to cause bodily harm. They are only perpetuated by strangers. Rape needs to be life-threatening, and rape is caused by an individual's dress, behavior, and risk-taking activities. And as we know, all of these four common narratives are definitely false. So the perpetuation of rape myths influences how victims, survivors disclose, how they accept, how they validate their own experiences of violence, and how individuals that are hearing their experiences of violence respond to those narratives. So sexual violence is a highly researched topic of study. When I was doing my literature review, I was finding a ton of information on sexual violence, but there still seems to be a slight gap within the research that my project aimed to fill. So when I was doing my analysis of the literature, I found a lot of quantitative information about the extent and effects of lived experience. But I found very little qualitative that kind of focused on the stories and the narratives of the individuals and what the experiences were like, and also retrospectively what the experiences were like. So there was also a lot of information in journals such as Violence Against Women and Interpersonal Violence, but I found a paucity in dissemination that is focused on nursing and psychiatric nursing. So as a psychiatric nursing professor, a psychiatric nurse myself, I was really interested in why there was this positive information within that realm, and maybe how my research could fill that gap. So this presentation specifically is really going to focus on that last bullet point, and I'm going to review the narratives of 6 of my victim survivors alongside policies and procedures from the institution that those individuals attended when they actually experienced their sexual violence. So that's what this presentation is going to focus on. The remainder of my PhD focuses on some of the other gaps. So the overall question of my research was, what is the retrospective life experience of individuals marginalized by gender who encounter sexual violence in post-secondary education? And my sub-question was, how can large institutions, specifically post-secondary and psychiatric mental health nurses in clinical research and education, improve the way they handle disclosures of sexual violence? So my methods of recruitment were quite extensive. I did letters of invitation sent from alumni services. Then I also did posters, newspapers, advertisements, and social media campaigns. The poster that you see there is one of the things that went out to social media and was also plastered all over Brandon. So I put it in the Keystone Center right before a massive farming conference, and it was posted all over in coffee shops all over Brandon as well. There also ended up being an article in the Brandon Sun and then an interview on CBC Radio, which really helped to get the last few of my participants for the project. So as mentioned, I ended up interviewing 10 individuals that self-disclosed an experience of sexual violence in post-secondary education, and they all graduated from post-secondary institutions in Manitoba between 1990 and 2010. So retrospectively, they defined their experiences as rape, attempted rape, and stealthing. Perpetrators were boyfriends, friends, roommates, and strangers. Most told close friends, family, or romantic partners sometimes, but this was sometimes years after the experience. Some disclosed for the first time during this interview process, and some never disclosed to anybody other than counselors later on in life. None of the participants disclosed to authorities, post-secondary education systems, or mental health services at the time of the incident. So as I mentioned, this presentation focuses on 6 of these participants who went to school in the same location. The demographics for the interview participants can be seen on the screen. So there were 2 different stages of Thank you. My husband's just bringing me a coffee. Thank you. There's two different phases of data collection within this project. There are interviews, and then there's also document analysis. So those are the two things that I'm going to focus on today. So I conducted 10 semi-structured interviews, and they lasted between 55 and 115 minutes. Each interview began with a pre-interview that consisted of a very informal conversation to allow the participants to get a chance to know me, get a chance to know why I was doing this research, my own personal histories with sexual violence, why this is important, all those different things to be able to gain a little bit of rapport with the interviewees. Then after the interviews, I did a process of debriefing, which we discussed the process of the research, suggestions for improvement, ideas about dissemination, and then also concentrated on the participants' overall emotional state. Before individuals left the interview, I provided them with a brochure that talks about ways to deal with trauma responses and resources available in the community, and they also all received a small amount of money as a thank you for their participation in the research. The data collection and data analysis was definitely a different process. So I requested documents from Brandon University, Assiniboine Community College, and University of Manitoba, which were the three institutions that my participants attended post-secondary education. Only Brandon University responded to me. So that was the only institution that I was even able to dig into the documents that were available. All of the document review occurred in July of 2020. So as we know, that wasn't the easiest time in our history. So that might have been one of the reasons why the other two institutions did not make their policies available. But I did read all the available policies, the Senate meeting minutes, and student handbooks. So it was a fair amount of information, but really I could not find very much specifically that related to sexual harassment, sexual violence, sexual assault, rape, any of those topics. So in the end, I ended up with two institutional policies. They were dated from 1980 and 2007. 1989, that's wrong on the screen. It was 1989 and 2007. And then there were two mentions of the policy in Senate minutes, one in 1992 and one in 1994. And then I was also able to find 5 student handbooks between 1989 and 1993. And they did have mention of sexual harassment in them. So the documents really represented two very different branches of the university. The policies in the Senate documents represented the broader formal institutions that were available in the institution at that time, whereas those student union handbooks really were a lot more progressive, and they kind of talked about the informal aspects of the university. So the archives had 2 versions of a sexual harassment policy, as I mentioned. Overall, the main differences between those 2 policies were the introductory statements, the definitions of sexual harassment, the makeup of the sexual harassment committee, and the language and order of the explanation of disciplinary action and malicious complaints. So the malicious complaint of the policy dated in 2007 is what you're looking at your screen and what is available on the screen. In this policy from 2007, there was a lot more emphasis on malicious complaints. And this was prior to explanation of disciplinary action if someone breaches the policy. So meaning that there was emphasis on malicious reporting before there was emphasis on what would happen to somebody who breached the policy. Of note, those older policies, neither of them had information about or defined rape. None of them had other forms of sexual violence. And the policy in 2007 alluded to unnecessary physical contact, but it was not explicit in their definition. So the Senate minutes that I found between 1990 and 2010 only had 2 written mentions of sexual harassment. In 1992, the minutes reflected mention that the sexual harassment policy should be included in a larger discrimination and harassment policy. And then in 1994, there was a documented memorandum of understanding sent from the employers union to the university president's office indicating that the sexual harassment committee had not met in a significant amount of time. I wasn't able to find any follow-up in regards to that MOU. In all of the student handbooks and the manuals, they all had a sexual harassment, the sexual harassment policy, sorry. They all had that in between page 75 and 90 of the BUSU Student Union Handbook. So the example from 1993 of what that looked like in all of the consecutive BUSU documents is on the screen in front of you. Additionally, the student handbooks did have a small section on sexual assault with definitions, and they specifically concentrated on rape, unwanted touching, a paragraph about responsibility for sexual assault that included a statement that indicated that a man never has the right to pressure a woman for sex, and a recognition that sexism perpetuates rape myths. The BUSU documents also had sexual assault facts and tips on how to stay safe. However, when you were looking at those tips and facts, they often reiterated some of those rape myths that we discussed earlier, such as staying safe on the streets, not allowing strangers into your home, not entering elevators if you feel unsafe, and reporting strangers on campus to police. So really, it was kind of perpetuating those rape myths that were available in that time to different individuals within the institution. So some of my general thoughts about the document analysis was that overall, the handbooks provide some relevant messaging, such as that sexism perpetuates rape myths and that a man does not have a right to pressure a woman into sex. But as I mentioned, they really do also perpetuate the typical rape myths by addressing the stereotypical rape scenario, that stranger in a dark alley with the victim survivor always being a woman. Also, the institution does not provide definitions. So the institution itself does not provide different definitions of the different types of sexual violence that many people experience. And the problem is that many individuals may not identify their experiences as sexual harassment, which is the language that's used in the policy. So the lack of definitions may be a barrier for reporting and seeking assistance. There's also a disconnect between what was seen in the messaging from the student unions and the messaging from the university. And there was that overall lack of messages about sexual violence that perpetuated those rape myths. Overall, my general thoughts on the document analysis was that it was quite concerning to read all these different things, as I'm sure all of you would understand and relate to, because with the common occurrences of sexual violence in post-secondary institutions, there's an ongoing problem that we still need to address. That was back then, and there's a lot of things that we still need to address now too. Okay. So how does this relate to the voices of my participants? So really, I'm concentrating on 3 different themes within the voices from my participants: naming, disclosing, and validating. So when we're thinking about naming, many of the victim survivors expressed that retrospectively they had confusion over what had happened to them and how to describe it. For many of my participants, difficulty naming and talking about their violence was associated with the rape myth that rape needs to be caused bodily harm, rape needs to be life-threatening, and the perpetrator needs to be a stranger. For instance, one of my participants, Dawn, articulated that, "I remember thinking when I was younger, if he had gotten me in the street, then it would have been legit." Another rape myth that many of the participants discussed was the idea that the woman's dress, behavior, and risk-taking are to blame for the rape. The other thing to think about is disclosing. At the time of the sexual violence, most of the participants chose to not tell anyone about their experiences. With all of the victim survivors, a fear of not being believed, being shamed, or being embarrassed about the trauma they experienced dictated whether they would talk to someone or talk to the authorities. Danica experienced sexual violence from their best friend and roommate's boyfriend, and chose not to disclose or tell anyone about the violence. Because who would believe that? Everyone will believe the cheater part. They are not going to believe the other story. Coming to terms with the fact that they experienced sexual violence was a process for all of the participants. Zara, whose quote is on the screen, experienced stealthing at the time of sexual violence and had no idea how to explain the violation that they felt. It took Zara decades before they could validate the violence they had experienced. You know, it's only very recently in the last year that I learned this term, stealthing. You know, I had read a news story and then another news story where some court ruled that was sexual assault. Reading that news story was just satisfying because it was the final answer. It was okay for me to be upset as I was. So this presentation really explored the narrative of 6 victim survivors while simultaneously reflecting on the policies, messaging, and procedures regarding sexual violence reinforced at educational institutions. The narratives in the policy review not only emphasizes the existence of rape myths, but it also highlights the context of the educational institution that did not see, support, or provide any kind of education for students that experience sexual violence. Although the victims, survivors in this study are now able to name their experiences as sexual violence, at the time of the incident, similar to findings in a lot of other research studies, the participants grappled with naming, disclosing, and validating their experiences, which for some caused reluctance to speak about their experience and find support. It's impossible to imply that the policies and procedures reported on in this manuscript were the sole reason that our participants perceived their sexual violence experiences the way that they did. Rather, the policies and procedures provide insight into the circumstances, resources, and dialogue that was occurring regarding sexual violence at the time of our participants' victimization. The fact that the institution had one sexual harassment policy only, specifying just one negative incident in the spectrum of sexual violence, is problematic to say the least. The vague wording of the policy and lack of important definitions, such as the sexual assault and consent, is something noticed in a lot of other policy reviews conducted in other jurisdictions. The lack of description regarding sexual violence causes victim survivors to not report their experiences or seek resources through their post-secondary institutions because of a lack of clarity. And this is a failure on the part of the institution. It is the post-secondary institution's responsibility to ensure that the climate on campus reflects inclusive, welcoming, safe, and secure environments for all individuals. The emphasis on malicious or fraudulent reporting in both policies could be a deterrent to victim survivors reporting their personal experiences. And as suggested by our participants, naming and validating sexual violence experiences are difficult due to the influence of societal rape myths. So when you consider the confusion that victim survivors face about sexual violence experiences, institutions that provide warnings that malicious or fraudulent reporting is punishable creates another barrier for help seeking. When an individual is already having difficulty recognizing their sexual violence and labeling their trauma, being dismissed or not being believed becomes traumatizing again. So what should be done? Post-secondary institutions need to ensure that policies that address sexual violence are explicit. Clear definitions of sexual violence and examples where appropriate should be included. Those that experience sexual violence should be able to see their own experiences reflected in the language of the policy. Post-secondary institutions need to be wary of policies that discuss malicious or fraudulent reporting. They also need to be cautious of the punishment associated with these claims. The lack of incidences of false reporting and the overall lack of reporting sexual violence in general emphasizes that concerns over false allegations are disproportionate, and emphasis on this should be not included in policies on sexual violence. Messaging provided to students needs to be consistent. For instance, rape myths should be defined and examples included. When including tips about safety, post-secondary institutions need to be sure that they are not strengthening rape myths in their suggestions for safety. Post-secondary educational systems need to ensure that they are not perpetuating rape myths with their silence. Transparency in policy and protocols need to be evident and publicized for all post-secondary students, faculty, staff, and community members. And implementation of these policies needs to be a priority. By not clearly defining sexual violence and allowing the culture of misogyny to remain, post-secondary institutions are silent, and the silence perpetuates rape myths. This retrospective analysis that I've just presented to you of university policy and student handbooks with the experiences of victim survivors provides clues into the resources, messaging, and policies available to our victims and survivors from 1990 to 2010. Although this is not an indicator of current policies, the consistent rates of sexual violence, the perpetuation of misogynistic thought, policy blunders of Canadian post-secondary institutions in handling sexual violence, and the continued deficit in individuals reporting sexual violence all indicate that more work needs to be done within post-secondary institutions to change the institutional climate. Brandon University does now have a policy that was first approved in March of 2017 that is specifically called Brandon University Sexualized Violence Policy. This document clearly defines sexual assault, sexual violence, and sexual harassment, It also provides information on consent and uses the guiding principles of trauma-informed approach, victim survivor-centered approach, culture of consent, safety for all, prevention through education, and due process. However, at the time that I was putting this presentation and my dissertation together, the interim protocol lacked specificity, and there was a lack of transparency on the website as to the ways in which the protocols have been implemented and are implemented. There's also a lack of consistency in implementation of the policy. Sexual violence cannot be a policy afterthought. Ensuring that campuses are safe for gender marginalized individuals and that campus remains violence and harassment free needs to be prioritized. The respondents within our study show the importance of breaking down rape myths, providing voice to victim survivors, and creating a culture of post-secondary campuses that are supportive, continuing the status quo and insisting that sexual violence prevention can be done off the side of an already overworked sector is not the way forward. The safety of our students is dependent on policies, procedures, and positions that emphasize sexual violence prevention. So, thank you.